I really love what you said there. That sounds a lot, or sounds similar to what's been said by John Kiley, who we spoke to not too long ago, as we were talking about periodization and how, even though we have different periodization theories and theorists, we don't have data to show that any one particular model ends up being superior to others. And what we seem to understand right now is that we need to have a certain amount of variation so that athletes don't get stagnant. And then we also need to not have so much variation that they can't get better at the things that we're training. And it also sounds similar to what I've heard powerlifting coach Mike Tashir talk a lot about, and other coaches as well, in terms of trying to gather as much data as you can for individual athletes, because you might have things that work fairly well for most people most of the time, things that work really well for a smaller group of people sometimes, and things that don't work for another small group of people. And you won't necessarily know unless you have some way to try to establish a baseline of the metrics that you're trying to change, and then monitor them over time and see, for this person, this intervention seemed to work the way we thought it was, or that person got a really nice response out of this, or that person didn't respond, or they got worse. So tailoring your approach in terms of building that profile seems to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and again, like that's, I think physical therapists are finally realizing that we really need to incorporate training principles in our rehabilitation. And I think that you're seeing that more and more, right? So Phil Glasgow, who's with Irish Rugby at the moment, but Phil, I love this phrase. He usually says, rehab is training in the presence of injury. And I think we're slowly kind of getting that idea. So obviously early on in the rehab, periodization doesn't make much, you can't really get pushed hard enough, so that's fine. But pretty soon to the mid-end range, you've got to really start thinking about how you're structuring this program. And then you've got to have outcome measures. You've got to measure stuff. You've got to know whether the stuff we did yesterday has made you a little weaker, a little less flexible, a little something today, because then we know if it had a training effect. Yes, so we can keep going, and we can adjust for today, or you get the day off. But we know we've pushed you hard enough. And so those kind of principles is slowly or maybe becoming more prevalent in our rehab programs. And I honestly think that's where we need to go towards outcome-based rehabilitation and then monitoring. You've got to be able to show me that what you're doing actually works. And that's the harder part about something like the functional movement screen, where you've got a composite test, and it's really hard to know which part of this is getting better, worse, or not. But apart from that, I think that might be for some people a really good one. That's fine. And I think there are other really good tests that you can use to show that the intervention you're applying is working. And I'm convinced that pretty soon the insurers, the athletes, and the media will be asking us these questions. So we've got to be ready with an answer like, yep, it's working. He's actually running faster than last week. Or if you're not measuring it, you simply don't know.
Well, and if you don't understand the training process, because what if that athlete's not running faster this week, but we planned that training was supposed to be harder, and so we expect him to be slower. We've planned for that. To your point, I think you've made it here several times, is that you can't just take one test in isolation, and you also can't take a snapshot of the athlete's current readiness as just an indication of where they are as a whole. You've got to look at the entire process. When you were describing your process, I loved it because it was very pragmatic. You're taking baseline data, but then you monitor them over the course of the training process. And we've said on this podcast several times that your best screen is probably watching them over time during their training sessions. But then if you have data to fall back on, sure, you can kind of see, like, where do we start? Where are they now? Where were they last week? Where we hope and expect them to be next week? Does that line up with what happened in reality? So there's this constant kind of self-correcting and tinkering through the process, but you're just staying as informed as possible.
I mean, so we're skipping a little bit to rehab now, but I think that's okay. So Peter Blanche and Tim Gabbett wrote a really great piece, Has the Athlete Trained Hard Enough? And so in this, they kind of show that. So if we think about our chronic acute workloads, and of course during rehabilitation, your chronic workload is just going to drop, right? I mean, there's no way of keeping that the same, especially if you have something like a hamstring injury where we've pulled you out of regular training, and we're really doing the specific progressive loading program to get you back. So what usually happens is once you hit a certain kind of okayness, right? So either strength, speed, we did a couple of football sessions and you're ready to go, you're back in training. But of course, if you don't progressively build that back up again, you're just underprepared for the task that you're going to be thrown into. Then they have a re-injury. So we know from work from Roald Bahr, that's also a Norwegian researcher that used to be with us here at Aspetar, so that over 50% of re-injuries happen in the first month. So the athlete re-injures, and what do? So, okay, we push too hard, we'll take it easy, we'll bring it back a little bit, we won't push that hard, we'll make it, and we're just creating a cycle where we get these chronic rehabbers, if I can use the term. You know, the guys that are just in your clinic, and I think they just never get a chance to build up progressively to that workload they need, and we actually put them in a pretty difficult spot. So to your point, you know, that is exactly what we need to do, is monitor our athletes and monitor them through rehab and as they go back to return to sport, to make sure we're getting them ready for the performance that they need.
Are you guys tracking specific metrics for workload? Is it SRPE load, where you take that session RPE times time? Are you looking at various metrics to track workload?
So we're just in the process of writing up some data, looking at a couple of seasons now of SRPE, so indeed session ratings perceived exertion, and also some GPS measures. But that looks like it'll be more for the future. I think session RPE or SRPE might be a really good measure that's really simple to do if you do it well, and if you make sure you try and eliminate the potential, kind of bias that the athletes might experience in actually reporting that. But if you do it well, I think that might be a really good way, or a really simple way of just monitoring the load that the players are under. Of course, if you have more specific load, the more specific it gets, I think the better you'll be able to track certain elements of their training. And I think where we're still lacking now is, like in soccer, for instance, we can't possibly, it's hard to measure at the moment how many kicks you do, for instance, and how many of those are long passes and short kicks. And so really to if we want to get really into it, that's what we really need to do. But at the moment, I think that might be something that's really valuable. So our data is still being processed at the moment and analyzed, but we'll have something on that soon. I mean, there has been some really nice work from Laura Bowen, published in BJSM, the British Journal of Sports Medicine, recently, and showing that it looks like there is some relationship between workload and injury. I think at this stage, though, we're still not quite sure how to look at it. So there's so many iterations of workload and acute to chronic workload and rolling averages, exponentially weighted. There's just too many at the moment. We're still figuring out how to really use that in a sensible way. But it seems like that there's a clear relationship, and we need to try and understand how that fits in the big picture, as we said earlier.